Well, tonight, as I say, it's a slightly briefer Bible study, and I'm not going to give a detailed verse-by-verse exposition with all the parts, but try to capture the essence of what Paul is saying in this illustration that he set before us, and to take some points of application to our hearts. Now, of course, we know that chapter 9, as I've mentioned before, is about the subject of self-denial. And this is a wonderful picture of self-denial in the illustration that Paul gives of running as an Olympic athlete. I'm sure you would agree that no Olympic athlete fails to experience some measure of self-denial. And I remember one of my favourite athletes, Steve Redgrave, the rower, won a number of Olympic golds, and he used to get up at something like 4 o'clock in the morning to be on the river and working hard each and every day for a long period of time, something like 16 years. He was an Olympian, and great sacrifice was made, and he was looking forward to his retirement when he wouldn't have to get up so early. But of course, this is about self-denial, and also the waiving of our rights for the sake of the gospel. And that's one area of self-denial. We will deny ourselves certain things lest our weaker brother falter and fall because of our use of liberty. And so Paul talks about the waiving of his rights. He sets himself as an example, as an apostle. He waived his right for financial support for the sake of the gospel that was in its very early stages in the church at Corinth. But he does so because he brings forth this wonderful truth that the gospel is worthy of any sacrifice that we make. And there is a sacrifice to make. Those who will leave family and home to go to the other side of the world and set up, as it were, a new ministry in a very different culture, there are sacrifices. We might think of it as an adventure. But in truth, in reality, there are many sacrifices made when anyone becomes a foreign missionary, or if anyone enters into the ministry, or if, as Christians, we engage in the life of the church, and rather than being on the periphery, we get into the centre of it, and we serve Christ. And it will require sacrifice. You'll have to put aside an evening for prayer, so that you're perhaps ministering to a group of children. You would want to know something about them and their home situation. You would visit them. You would have them over for tea. You would pray for them. Then you would prepare your message. You would find your illustrations and many other such things. And it takes a lot of sacrificing other things, your leisure time, you might say, to be involved in that preparation. The actual teaching and running of a youth club or Sunday school is one small part of the whole. And it's like that in any ministry. We give so much more behind the scenes, and we sacrifice time and effort and that we could have been doing in other things. But the gospel, we would say, is worthy of any sacrifice we make. It's when you're in a situation like those pastors in the Ukraine at the present time who, rather than fleeing with everyone else, send their wife and children away and stay behind and use the church as a shelter and seek to bring the gospel of hope and minister to the sick and many other such things. Yeah, that's a sacrifice, isn't it, that people make? But again, they consider that worthy a sacrifice to make, and even if it comes to their own lives, they're willing to give that. I think anyone understands this. So the Christian spirit I just want to think about this for a moment. The Christian spirit is the giving of ourselves. It's not what the church can do for me, but what can I do for Christ in the local church? So again, we're not this kind of mentality, the spirit of the world. I'm the consumer. I'm the person that you need to serve. Okay, and I expect certain standards and other such things. Some people have that mentality when they come to church. Is what I'm going to get out of it, rather than this is an opportunity. Particularly in a small church, there is so much that I can do for Christ in the church. So we have this, what I call the Christian spirit, is the giving of ourselves. And that means we are denying ourselves certain things. If anyone come after me, Jesus said, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. So there it is, even taking up the cross speaks of the whole area of sacrifice. We give ourselves, and we consider him who gave everything to us on the cross. In fact, his very life, we are willing to give our very lives for Jesus Christ. I was speaking to some men today as we were preaching the open air, and they were saying, well, the days may be short where we can actually legally proclaim the gospel. There seems to be, this assault on free speech, particularly on gospel preachers in the open air. And we were speaking about some of the events up in Manchester, for example, where people have found it great difficulty in the city square, as it were. And my answer to them, well, at the moment things are free and easy, but will we be here when it's not so easy, when we will be arrested for preaching in the open air? Are we prepared to stop then? And I was just challenging the whole concept of, we must give ourselves to the work and bear the cost in doing so. So we give ourselves. That's the Christian spirit. We believe that all that we have belongs to the Lord. We are stewards of what we have, and our great aim is to be good and faithful stewards, and to use the time, the energy, the money, ourselves, our very selves, to give ourselves to Christ. How can I serve him best? Etc. So our great aim, the great aim of the Christian with that Christian spirit, is to be a profitable servant. Often I've focused on the aim of being a faithful servant. Well, of course, that is first and foremost. But to be profitable and to trade with the gospel. We read, did we not, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where it says, do the work of the evangelist. It says, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. And so it says, but you be watchful in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. There it is. Give yourselves to the work. And, that's what we must do in our individual ministries within the church. We want to be profitable. We want to see souls saved. We want to be those that God's will is that we bear fruit, and much fruit that will abide. And so again, we do things in a way. We've already seen the whole idea of the farmer, the great labour that there is in farming. It requires a farmer gets up, not at 10 o'clock in the morning, but when the rooster crows, maybe at 4 in the morning. He has to get up and he has to tend to the animals, and it's a long working day. He gives himself. And of course, the expectation, the reason I use this as an illustration, is the effort isn't that he just comes to the end of the season and there's no harvest. He particularly nurtures his crops and his animals so that they produce much milk or much fruit or and other such things. Profit. So we're thinking of spiritual profit, a profitable servant. So I think these closing words then are for us all. These words. Do you know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives a prize? So we're all involved in a spiritual race. All run in the race. So the Christian isn't those who stand on the side cheering on those who are running, but we're involved. Might be some kind of endurance race. I think it's more likely to think of it in that way. And you think of a marathon, people of different abilities, but they train, they turn up, they run, they see the course to the end. You know, there are many like thoughts in the Christian life as being a race, one that requires effort and focus. I always feel like Eric Liddell standing up and giving an address talking about, what it means to run a straight race. I don't know if you've seen that film, Chariots of Fire. You get a little bit of preaching, only a few words, but he says that, doesn't he? How we must run a straight race. So we're involved in a race. You might not feel like an athlete tonight, but you are in a race. It's just as if we are all involved in a warfare. Now, you might not like the whole idea of warfare and spiritual warfare, but you have no choice. You are engaged with an enemy. It's not a time of peace. The time of peace is in heaven. This world is hostile to the gospel. The devil himself wants to fire his fiery darts at us, and we need to stand in the Lord and fight and put the belt of truth on, and the shield of faith and the sword of the Spirit, the helmet of salvation, and engage in warfare. I'm sure those people in the Ukraine do not want war. They want peace, they want democracy, and they want to get on with their lives. They want to send their children to school and get their shopping in and, just live a life. And do their sport and social activities like we would do here in our country, a place of freedom and democracy. But of course, they, against their will, are having to buckle down and put down the hatches and flee to places where the army aren't, because they're being invaded. They never asked for that. They never, kind of said, come and attack us then. No, this is something they dread. And it's a horrible experience, and we sympathise with them. They are involved in a warfare because they have an opponent who I believe is driven by evil, who has an agenda. Well, similarly, the devil believes this world belongs to him, and he wants to take control of it. So again, we are involved whether we like it or not. We have to face up to the reality, and we have to be manly and be a good soldier in Jesus Christ, we're told to be. So again, we're involved in an activity. Now, I remember speaking on this very text. I don't know whether Becky might remember it, but it was in Birmingham. And I was asked to give an address to some of the young people after a church service. And so I took as my text this very words here that we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So it's been a good 30 plus years since I've preached on this text. But I remember when I spoke in the late 80s, what caught my attention is where it says the games, those who compete in the games. And the idea here is, I had in mind the Olympic Games. Now there were a number of Hellenistic games, 4 of them, and they ran them every 2 years. 4 places. Olympia is one of them. Corinth is another. But it caught my attention. This text centers it very much around the time of the Olympics. I think I did preach this text in a gospel service during some Olympic Games, or the start of the Olympic Games or whatever. But I can't remember what I said on that occasion. I certainly don't have the notes. But what I knew was that to compete at a high level requires much self-denial. And I myself had been put onto the Olympic team that was heading out to the Olympics in Seoul in 1988. And I'd won the British Student University Championships or something or other, and it entitled me to be part of that team, which they would select to go to the Olympics. And we were given a routine of what you had to do on a daily basis, how you had to watch what you ate and the amount of hours that you were expected to train. And you would have to travel up to the Kodokan in London, where you would meet with the rest of the team and go through a very hard training time. And of course it required much self-denial. But then I became a Christian. And when I became a Christian, I decided that I would give up my place on the team and resigned. And in fact, I gave up sometime shortly afterwards the whole sport that I was involved in at that time. And I did it for a very good reason, because I was a Christian. It was taking up far too much of my time. I wanted to study the Bible. I wanted to get involved in overseas student work, and it took up so much of my time. I couldn't combine the two. One had to yield to the other. And so I very gladly gave up my place on the team. So again, I knew how much at that time there is a requirement to train hard and for self-discipline. So as I say, these Olympic Games were that was just one of 4. This is the Isthmian Games, where Corinth acted as the host. So there would be thousands of athletes turning up at Corinth, and their supporters and other such things, and they would cheer them on in the stadium and other such places. So they were very familiar. So Paul picks up on this illustration of how much self-denial an athlete goes through and applies it to the Christian life. And he says, run in such a way that you might win the prize. So this isn't something which you just do casually. This is something where you are dedicated to and give many hours of hard preparation. It requires 2 things in particular: dedication and self-denial. And those are 2 aspects of which we must give in the Christian life. I have shifted my focus as time has gone on. Now I'm an older man, not so much engaged in physical activity or certainly not competitive sport anymore. And my eye moves from what we have in one of these verses, in verse 25. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now my focus used to be on the word compete. And again, if you look at the Greek, you would find a word, agonizomai, where we get the word agonize. Okay? So when you agonize, you push yourself so hard. It's the exertion, the physical exertion of pushing your body to its very limits. And that's what I used to focus on when I was younger. But I've come to see that the key verse here, when you look at the context of the whole chapter, isn't so much the competitiveness or the effort that you must put into the Christian life, but what it says here, temperate. That's the key word, is to be temperate. And rather than exertion, temperance. It could be described as the discipline involved in training. You have to be, as I say, dedicated, and there needs to be discipline. Now, it's good for every Christian to have discipline. It's when we lack discipline that we become half-hearted and lazy, unpunctual, and we don't give ourselves consistently to our ministry. We don't want to be those kind of people that are half-hearted. We want to be full-hearted. Now that involves discipline. And, this is so important. And particular in the whole subject, the discipline which requires self-denial. This is what it means to be temperate. So we set limits and we train hard in a regular, disciplined way. Now, you could see in a race, it would be very foolish of anyone to turn up at the start line and he hasn't trained. It's got two things here, the athlete and the boxer. So the boxer's he hasn't been in the ring, he hasn't been doing the weights, he's quite flabby, he's quite unfit. He's not going to last however many rounds the boxing contest will be. By the time of the third or fourth round, he's exhausted, and he's going to be, his opponent will take advantage of it. But it would be foolish to turn up at a running race without any training. Now I'm going to use an illustration of someone that you might know. It was my third son, Samuel, who last year decided that he would compete in a half marathon that was being run just outside Canterbury. And Samuel, being the kind of character he is, he'd been going to the gym and pushing some weights and, getting fit, but he hadn't done any training, he hadn't done any running. And I remember saying to him that you're going to not finish the course. I said, by the time you get into 5 miles into the course, cramp is going to set in and you're going to come to a stop. Well, he bought his kit that very morning. He borrowed a pair of shoes, running shoes. He said, I'll be okay, in his kind of way. But sure enough, by the time it got to 6 miles in, I suggested 5. Half a marathon is obviously 13 miles. So less than halfway through the course, 6 miles in, cramp set in. And he says that he did something to one of his tendons or something or other, he had to be put into the ambulance and driven back to the start line, or the finish line, should I say. But, there he was, full of youthful vigour and confidence, 25 years old. But he couldn't finish. Why? Because he hadn't trained. He hadn't trained. And I did say to him, the kind of muscles that you've been working on are not the same kind of muscle fibre that you're going to need for an endurance race. So my prediction wasn't too far wrong. It was 6 miles rather than 5. You need to be prepared. You need to train. You need to go out on, if you're going to run half a marathon, you need to be regularly running 5, 6, 7 miles on a regular basis, 2, 3 times, maybe every day, and build up the right kind of muscle fibre, which is red muscle fibre, that will help supply the oxygen to the muscles so they won't seize up. So the athlete then must be dedicated to training. We're talking about an Olympic athlete here, dedicated to training. So he watches what he eats. Okay? He's not going down filling his face with pizza and fast food and other such things. He's thinking about his protein content of his meals. He's thinking of carbohydrates, and an athlete thinks of very slow-releasing carbohydrates, fast-releasing carbohydrates. He staggers it all, ready for the race. He's thinking very clearly about the energy that he's going to need for this race. So he's very careful about what he eats. The diet is very important. The hours that he sleeps. So he's not going to be staying up watching films late into the hour, in the early hours of the morning. That kind of athlete doesn't win races. It's the one who goes to bed early. I would say to you, in the Christian life, don't be one that stays up into the early hours of the morning. Get a good early night. Early to bed, early to rise. It's kind of almost a proverbial kind of thing that your parents may have said to you many years ago. But it's true in the Christian life. So I say to you, be disciplined in going to bed at a regular hour, and be disciplined in getting up at a regular hour, early in the morning. Engage in your study of God's Word and pray and, have time. Don't be ill-disciplined. So the athlete, he watches what he eats, the hours he sleeps, and there is a will, it's his will to win that pushes his body to the limit. We must run in such a way as to win the prize. To train, I would say. Now, when it says run here, I would take this word, train in such a way that there is discipline in your life. Of course, we've got here that Paul doesn't want to be disqualified. Now, how does that all fit in? Because he talks about disciplining his body, doesn't he, in verse 27. He says, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." So Paul doesn't want to be disqualified. He's thinking of himself, as we saw in 2 Timothy chapter 4, as the evangelist, as the one who gives himself for the sake of the gospel. So the gospel preacher, let's think of the gospel preacher for a moment, he must give 100% to his preaching. He must give 100%. He can't give 50% or even 80%. And I say this if you're a youth leader or a Sunday school leader or part of the team, and you've got something to do, Don't do it half-heartedly. Give 100%. So you've got that message. You've got those young people for maybe 10 minutes in a Sunday school or 20 minutes in a youth club. You're thinking very carefully, preparation. You give yourself 100% to that work. It would be wrong for a gospel preacher to turn up into the pulpit with no preparation. Can you just think of the parallel that Paul is bringing here? Here's the gospel preacher. Now, some people say, about preaching extempore. But as has often been said, if anyone who knows anything about extempore preaching, you put sometimes more effort into your preparation so that you can preach extempore than if you have a full set of notes. You have to work much harder. You have to know exactly where you're going, all the twists and turns. And extempore preaching isn't turning up and winging it. You've got to give yourself to that preparation. So you don't want to become disqualified. You must prepare for the pulpit, or you cannot live life without prayer. So again, you're involved in a ministry. You cannot engage in that ministry if you don't regularly pray for those you minister to. You must have prayer. Prayer is so important for the success of the gospel. Other things you must do. You must not fill your heart with lusts if you are to preach the gospel with compassion. So you can't be full of the world and the love of this world and then turn up in the pulpit and address a group of people and preach the gospel in a passionate way for those souls. You can't have both things filling your heart. You've got your great consuming passion is for the saving of souls. So the preaching of souls. So Paul is thinking here in this passage not just of the body, but also of his mind as well. And this is something that we just need to focus on for a moment. We need to think about our mind. We need to develop a mind. A mind that is pure. When it comes to gospel work, we must have a pure mind and a pure heart. These are the requirements in engaging in any Christian work. A pure mind and a pure heart. Because if our mind and our heart is not pure, if it is, for example, someone without a pure heart, he might want to do something to get recognition and get the praise of men, and it feeds his pride. Now, again, if you're going to preach in such a way that people will admire you and set you up and, praise you and such, then there's a very wrong motive. And you can fall into the snare of the devil. So you don't want to be disqualified. Without a pure mind and without a pure heart, it's possible that you can become disqualified. What does it mean? What does Paul mean here? He says that others are saved, but we're not. Here's a thought. That other people are saved and we have deluded ourselves in thinking that we're Christian, and we're not. We've preached to others and we are, and that's what it says here, doesn't it? He says, lest when I have preached to others, I myself might be disqualified. I need to make sure that I am a converted person and I am preaching with pure motives to glorify Christ. To the number of people that are in the pulpit who are unconverted. There is called an unconverted ministry. that should never be in the pulpit. But there are dead churches, and there are dead ministers, spiritually dead. And they're preaching to others, and they might even be preaching from the Bible, the Gospels, talking about the necessity of being born again, and they're not born again themselves. And when revival came, I remember reading a biography a long, long time ago about a man called Daniel Rowland. And he himself wasn't sure as to whether he was converted, whether he was born again. And so he was encouraged to keep preaching the gospel until he himself felt the gospel himself. And there came a time where he really experienced it. I'm not sure whether he was converted under his own ministry. But there are many a person that like that, and they see the necessity of being born again and preach. I think it was said a similar thing to Wesley, if my memory from many years back serves me right, that he had to preach. He says, I don't know how to preach faith. I don't even know whether I am saved myself. He says, keep preaching about faith in Christ until you have faith in Christ yourself. It's a sort of strange part of history. But you see, the whole point is that you can be a preacher and preach very well and not be converted. You're disqualified, aren't you? You preach to others have been saved, and you haven't trusted Christ yourself. You haven't been born again yourself. This is what Paul's saying. Seems strange perhaps in our context, but in many, many places it's a word in season. So here's the thing. Godliness is the hallmark of a Christian. Now, I often said humility is the hallmark of a Christian, but godliness. If you've got a man, and he's a man of the world, there he is, he loves the world and all the things in the world, and he engages in worldly pursuits and activities, and when it comes to Sunday and he puts on a suit and he preaches the gospel, and no godliness. There needs to be a consistency, a godliness in the person. So again, this is all part of keeping a close watch, not just on the body, but on the soul, the mind, the heart. The attitude of an athlete is to give his very best. And therefore he disciplines his body, he experiences denial of many things. The Christian is in a spiritual race and a spiritual fight. But the same principles hold as to discipline. You need to bring the soul in subjection to God. And that takes effort. To bring your whole soul it's subject to God, even to the point where you're saying it's not my will anymore, it's what God's will. Not my will be done, but your will be done. That's what Christ said, didn't he? He's the example of it. So there must be certain things about the soul. Here are some things for us all, not just the gospel preacher or the servant in the church, but we need to deny the soul. We need to deny lust. Don't allow lust to enter into your mind and heart. You need to humble your pride. Pride is something that can rise up within us. He speaks about disciplining his body. And he's not shadow boxing, he's really doing something about it. We've got to humble our pride. We've got to reject lies and furnish our mind with truth. So we're putting into the soul, we're disciplining it, we're making sure that which is unhealthy and unhelpful is put out. Unbelief needs to be evicted. Okay, so you're thinking about a house and you've got a tenant and you evict him. You get the bailiffs in and they throw him out into the street. I remember living in a house in Oxford one time, and the bailiffs came for my neighbour who was sharing the same downstairs ground floor as I was. And the bailiffs came in. We're kind of hiding behind a door listening. And they came with their battering ram, bashed in the door. They took hold of him and his stuff and threw him out. Now, you've got to do that with your unbelief. Unbelief comes in, and worldly ideas, you've got to evict them. And you've got to invite faith to come and reside instead. So I'm using these metaphors. Leisure needs to be replaced with service. Oh, we all like our leisure time, don't we? You know, you've got your work time and you've got your leisure time. And some people have got so much leisure time, they've got very little service time. You find where are the people to engage in the various ministries? There's no voluntary principle because they love their leisure. So leisure must be replaced with service. To deny yourself. What does this mean? To deny yourself is to deny sin. To deny self, right? Now, we're thinking of we spoke last week about a period of Lent where you're denying yourself a bar of chocolate or something like this. But the real denial is to deny sin. I will not let that sin have control. I will mortify it. I will pray about it. I will turn from it. I will spurn it. I will starve it. To deny self is to deny sin. And like the athlete, you become spiritually stronger as a result. So the athlete, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, week after week of training, and he becomes spiritually stronger. So this is the wonderful illustration that Paul is giving on the whole subject of self-denial in the Christian life. But in closing, you notice it says, run in such a way to receive that you may obtain the prize. Keep your eye on the prize. Keep your eye on the prize. Think of what that means. This immortal crown that you will be given. This well done, good and faithful servant. Store up for yourself treasures in heaven rather than on earth. It says that the athlete, he competes to get a perishable crown. Very interesting reading some of what some commentators thought this perishable crown was made. You hear about the laurel wreath that's kind of woven together. It was interesting that it said that they used the leeks. And leeks are quite stringy, you probably notice. And they would take the string off a leek and wove it into a kind of crown. So you've got a crown made of leeks and other such things that they would wear. It's not going to last. It's going to perish. But we do it. We look forward to the immortal crown. The crown that will last. And Paul's got this idea, as we saw in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where he says, I have fought the good fight. I've finished the race. Okay? He's gone through the finishing line. The end of life. Now they're stored up for him. The awards. He says, now there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. That's a wonderful thing in competing, in competitions. when you get to stand upon the podium. In the Olympic Games, there might be the national anthem, and there's the person full of pride, of this is what he's wanted, isn't it? He's sitting first place. I always used to say silver is a loser's medal. I always wanted the gold, right? Better a bronze than a silver, I always said, right? The gold medal, there you are, the national anthem. And then you're going to be awarded. I got awarded a medal in 1979 by a man called Robin Otani. Now, you won't know that name, but his father was the one who brought judo over from Japan into England and started at the Kodokan. And this was his son, 7th Dan black belt. And I was being awarded that by this person. It was a very moving moment. Well, it's going to be a very moving moment when you stand at the end and the Lord himself, the Lord Jesus Christ, awards you that immortal crown and says, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, may we be those who, it's not just about the effort that you make. It is about that. It is about the agonizing, but it's the discipline. It's keeping those very things out of your life that will ruin your Christian life and your walk. Give yourself entirely to Jesus Christ. And may he help us as we do so. Amen.